Let me focus your attention this morning on James chapter 4. We're going to look at verses 13 through 17 this morning. James chapter 4, we're continuing our study through the book of James in a series that I've entitled The Gospel of Works. And this morning we're looking at verses 13 through 17 of chapter 4. James writes, "Come now, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." And may God add his rich and profound blessing on this portion of his holy and inspired word. There may be nothing more pure and to the point than the words of a man who knows that he's dying. Michael Spencer was a writer and a preacher who died last year of cancer at the age of 54, and he left his wife of 31 years, Denise, behind along with two children in their 20s, and he wrote this 10 months before he died. It's amazing how knowing that you're going to die clarifies everything. It clarifies your perspective. It clarifies your priorities. It clarifies what's most important about life. And 10 months before Michael Spencer died, he wrote this: "The big issues that face me as a dying teacher, writer, husband, father, and employee are all about grace. Grace in everyday life. Grace to people who don't deserve it. Grace as a way for me to live in the power of the gospel when I'd rather be controlling things and determining outcomes. All day, every day, I have to live in an atmosphere where the use of law, guilt, manipulation, and punishment are the standard ways of doing business. But I want my life to be more and more and more about grace. So the question for me today and from now on is, has grace made me gracious?" Amazing words from a man whose body was racked with cancer, knowing that he was going to die very soon. Well, as we've been making our way through the book of James, I mentioned when I introduced this series that there are two ways to read this book. You can read it one way and become a Pharisee. You can read it another way and become a deeper lover of Jesus. If you read it in the sense that our good works direct God's favor, then you'll become amazingly depressed when you fail and amazingly proud when you succeed. And as a result, you will approach life very moralistically and legalistically. But if you understand James to be describing a life that reflects God's favor, not a life that directs God's favor, then you will become a deeper lover of Jesus and one who greatly appreciates the gospel of God's amazing free grace even more. And so as we've been making our way through the book of James, what we've discovered is that James shows us what the gospel of grace looks like in action. What does God's grace practiced on the front lines of life look like? It's a practical book that answers the question, if your heart has been gripped by God's unconditional love and grace and forgiveness, then what will your life begin to look like? And some of the things that we've looked at have been paradigm shattering. What does a grace-fueled, gospel-driven life look like? And we've looked at that in terms of the words that we use, the things that we say or the things that we don't say. We've looked at our relationships last week and the week before. What does God's amazing grace lived out in the context of our relationships mean? So we've looked at how grace shapes our use of words and how grace shapes our relationships. This week, James answers, what does your planning begin to look like when your heart is gripped by the gospel? And last week, we looked at this. In verse 12, James says, there's only one lawgiver. This week, he says, there's only one plan giver. As we looked at last week, if we forget the true lawgiver, we'll make our own faulty laws that will ruin our relationships. This week, we see that if we forget the true plan giver, we'll make our own faulty plans that will ultimately destroy our sense of purpose and the direction of our life. So in these verses, James addresses two paths: the path of presumption and the path of peace. Two paths that we can follow, two paths that we can walk along, the path of presumption and the path of peace. He talks about the path of presumption, the first path, in verse 13. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit." Now, what he's describing there is something that is incredibly common to all of us, Christian or non-Christian, whether you believe in Jesus or don't believe in Jesus. What he describes here is something that is remarkably common. Remember, James is writing this letter to Christian people. So he's not simply describing here in these verses, even though for our very self-righteous selves, it would be very comforting for us to think that James is strictly talking about people outside the church here, but he's talking about people inside the church. He's talking about you and me. This is very common. And what he's addressing here, what he's talking about here, is how often we go about our life and plan and set goals without reference to God whatsoever. We make our way through this life, we journey along the road of life, and we make plans and we set goals and we do all of these things without reference to God whatsoever. And he moves here, as you notice, from a smaller subject, which is money and financial planning, to the larger problem of neglecting God in all of life. And he uses this idea of money and financial planning as an illustration of just one area in which we neglect God as we go about making our plans. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living, famously said that. Well, James is essentially saying here that the self-determined life is not worth living because it leads to slavery, not freedom. Remember, I mentioned, if you were here last week, I mentioned that this world promises that if we bank, if we depend on all of the things they're telling us will make us free, even though those things promise freedom, it actually makes us a slave. And so what James is saying here is the self-determined life, the self-made man, the ambition of the self-made man is driven by a longing to be free, but he says it's not worth living because instead of delivering freedom, it actually delivers slavery. Well, what's a self-determined life? I mean, he describes it here. A self-determined life is a life lived believing that what you do, where you go, and when you arrive is ultimately up to you. It's a life that categorically ignores 1 Corinthians 10:31, which is the essence of wisdom according to the Bible, where Paul writes, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. Live your life the way Martin Luther described it, coram Deo, before the face of God. Live your life the way the Puritans used to say it, before an audience of one. Live your life for God. Think God's thoughts after him. Paul says, take every thought captive to Christ. In other words, the self-determined life leads to slavery because now it becomes all about you and what you can do and how you can perform and what you can achieve. But as we'll see in a minute, the God-determined life leads to freedom because now life becomes all about what Jesus has accomplished, what Jesus has achieved, and what Jesus has done in our place as our substitute. And he says this self-determined life, he says in verse 16, that this is arrogant. The self-determined life is an arrogant life, a life that does not take into consideration who God is as the ultimate plan giver, as the ultimate determiner of all things, is an arrogant life, and it's arrogant because it's presumptuous. Now, I looked up the word presumption yesterday just to get a very clear definition for it, and the definition that I came on I thought was very helpful. Presumption literally means showing excessive self-confidence. It's believing that I can and must ultimately control the direction of my life. That's what it means. Notice what he says in verse 13. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow. Notice what he says at the end, or we'll spend a year there. Today or tomorrow, a year, presumes that I have to ultimately determine my time. Okay, he's addressing the issue of time there. The timing of things is ultimately up to me. Today, tomorrow, next year. And then notice what he says here. Go into such and such a town. That presumes that I have to ultimately determine my destination. So not only do I have to ultimately determine my time, but I have to ultimately determine my destination. Where I go is ultimately up to me. And then notice what he says, trade and make a profit. That presumes that I have to ultimately determine my accomplishments. So notice, it's building here, okay? His case is building. His case that a self-determined life leads to bondage and slavery. And as I say all the time, according to the Bible, slavery does not mean being chained up in a dungeon somewhere in a third world country. We know that there are brothers and sisters around the world who are enslaved physically in that way, but according to the Bible, slavery is self-reliance. It's self-dependence. And it's a slavery that you and I, at some level, every single one of us, suffer from. And we know the bondage of self-reliance. We know the bondage of self-dependence. When everything is dependent on us, when the outcome of things depends ultimately on us in our minds. He's building this case that we make this remarkable presumption that I have to ultimately determine my time, my destination, my accomplishments, where I go, what I do, when I arrive, and how much I accomplish is all up to me. All of my life, my past, my present, my future belongs ultimately to me. Now, the devil wants to deceive us into believing subtly that tomorrow will always come. It's one great deception that the devil tries to pass on us. This idea that you'll always have tomorrow. You'll always have the next moment. Proverbs 27:1 addresses that attempt by the devil by saying, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring." Pretty basic, foundational instruction, wise instruction. Now, where does this come from? Okay, what's going on down deep that compels us to take matters into our own hands? Okay, what he says here is pretty obvious. He's describing the kind of person who does not take God into consideration when we go about making life plans and setting goals and all of that stuff. But what is going on down deep inside all of us that compels us to take control of things? What's going on down deep inside that compels us to take matters into our own hands? So let's go a little bit deeper here. Okay, let's get uncomfortably probing here. Self-confidence masks a deep fear. Isn't it interesting that the people who come across as being the most confident are the people that we automatically assume are the strongest? But self-confidence masks a deep, deep fear. What is it inside of us that compels us to be presumptuous? That compels us to depend on ourselves and to have an unrealistic confidence in our abilities to determine our future, to determine our time and our place and our accomplishments. What is it? Well, it masks a deep fear. Self-confidence in every single one of us masks a deep fear. The fear that unless I control my own matters, I'll be left out in the cold. Every single one of you, whether you've been walking with Jesus for 6 months or 60 years, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, every single one of us are remarkably tempted to control things around us because we've concluded down deep that if things go out of control, we'll be left out in the cold. The person who seems strong on the outside is often masking painful feelings of fragility. Okay, so wives, be patient with your husbands. I know they want to come across as being remarkably strong and omnipotent, okay, omnicompetent. Oftentimes, when I probe my own heart, it's in those moments where I determine I need to come across the strongest is when I am covering up this painful sense of fragility. I'm masking a deep fear that if things don't go my way in this moment, I'm going to lose my sense of purpose. I'm going to lose my sense of identity. I'm going to lose my sense of security. My identity and my purpose and my security is dependent on my being able in this moment. We do this with our children all the time. I do it with mine. Right? Boys, you paying attention? I think so. Good. Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up from the boys. Good. We do this with our children all the time. All the time. We conclude that things have to go my way in this moment, or else I'm going to lose my sense of security and purpose and direction. It's up to me. It's what one writer calls the fear of the law of capability. This is the law that judges us wanting if we're not capable, if we can't handle it all, if we're not competent to balance our diverse commitments without a slip. We're all deeply afraid of, and at some level enslaved to, the law of capability. It's the law that is trumpeted and shouted from every sector of our society. Do more, try harder. You are what you become. You are what you do, as we'll see here in just a minute. Down deep, we're all afraid that if we can't control outcomes, everything will become chaotic. Anxiety, where does anxiety come from? Where does it come from? We're all anxious, and yet, God tells us, be anxious about nothing. We read that and we think, who's he talking to? Superman? I wake up with anxiety. I go to bed with anxiety. I go throughout the day weighed down by anxiety. What do you mean, do not be anxious about anything? There's plenty in our fallen world and in the context of our broken relationships that has the potential to produce anxiety. What do you mean, be anxious of nothing? Well, where does anxiety come from? Anxiety happens when we feel we're losing control. That's where anxiety is birthed. Anxiety happens in your life. It could be with regard to your health. It could be with regard to your wealth. It could be with regard to your relationships, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your children, your relationship with your parents, your relationship to one another. Anxiety happens when we feel we're losing control. This is what anxiety says. I know what I need, and I'm afraid God won't get it right. So I have to do it myself. Now, you wouldn't say that verbally, but let me tell you something about yourself. That's exactly what you're saying in your heart. Me too. Anxiety comes from this idea that I know what I need in this moment in order for me to feel secure and valued and worthy and all of those things. And I simply don't trust God to get it right. So I've got to do it myself. And when you depend on yourself to get it right, and things begin to spin out of control, or things don't go according to your plan, that's when anxiety happens. That's when you need Advil PMs to go to sleep, okay? Anxiety happens, okay? When we feel like things are spinning out of control. When we're losing control, when things aren't going according to our plan. And we're depending on ourselves and it's not happening the way we need it to happen. This is why James links presumption to arrogance. Okay, let's go one step deeper here. Ultimately, presumption is ultimately a failure to believe the gospel of free grace. Okay, now how is presumption and the gospel connected here? Okay, we've got, control, anxiety, self-reliance, presumption, all of this is mixed in together. But how is all of that anchored in a refusal to believe the gospel of free grace? How can a rediscovery of the gospel free us from presumption and arrogance and anxiety and self-reliance and all of those things? This is how it's a failure to believe the gospel of free grace. It's a failure to believe that everything I need in Christ I already have. You've heard me say that. That's what a rediscovery of the gospel in a moment of temptation, in a moment of anxiety, in a moment where we feel like we're losing control and we have to get something that we do not currently have in order for this moment to go the way it should go. See what's happening there? In that moment, what's going on is you are failing to believe that everything you need, you already possess in Christ. Take that power into the moment of temptation. Confront your anxiety with that. Because anxiety happens when you honestly think, I have to get this or make this happen in order for me to feel safe and secure. But the gospel comes in and smashes that by saying, you don't need anything apart from what you already possess in Christ, in order for you to experience the safety and the security and the meaning and the purpose and the significance and all of those things that you long for and that you crave. It's a failure to believe in the rich provisional resources that are ours in the gospel. That's what's going on. This is part of what preaching is intended to do. Help us become much more self-aware of what's actually going on deep inside our hearts when we are living life, so that we can address the root of the problem and not simply the fruit of the problem, which is what we spend most of our time doing. We spend most of our lives, we notice these bad behaviors, or we notice these bad trends in our lives, and what we spend our life doing is just simply, cleaning up the outside. And then we wonder why, we picked all the rotten fruit off our branches, but we wonder why a month later another rotten fruit grows. It's because the root needs to be addressed, or else the rotten fruit will just keep coming back. And we spend our lives exhaustingly trying to clean up the outside. Jesus addressed that with the Pharisees. He said, "You're remarkably clean on the outside, but you're dead on the inside." Whitewashed tombs, he called them. So it's this idea, anxiety happens when we disbelieve the gospel, when we say essentially, God's free grace is too good to be true, so I have to depend on my own abilities. It's too good to be true to actually believe that in this moment, everything I need and long for in Christ I already have. It's too good to be true. And so therefore, I have to depend on my own abilities. I have to depend on myself. The unconditional approval offered by God in Christ is too good to be true, so I have to earn the approval I crave by taking matters into my own hands and making something of myself. That's what's going on. So when I talk about the present power of the gospel, the present power of Christ's finished work for Christian people, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about bringing the resources of the gospel into our moments of anxiety and temptation, into our moments where we are tempted slavishly to depend on ourselves. The gospel confronts that and says, it is finished. It is finished. It's a done deal. You're free. Everything you need in Christ you already have. So you don't have to enslavingly go out and get for yourself something that you think you need. It's already yours. I've mentioned this before, but I'm embarrassed to admit that on numerous occasions, my wife and my children can back this up. On numerous occasions, I have spent up to 10 to 15 minutes walking around my house looking for my sunglasses. And they've been on my head the entire time. Or you may have made this mistake too. You walk around the house looking for your car keys. I did this the other day. I really did. I was walking around the house anxiously looking for my car keys. And I was, Kim, have you seen my keys? No, I always put them on the rack. Well, they're not on the rack. What'd you do with them? Okay, it's got to be her fault if I can't find my keys. Okay, obviously. Boys, have you seen the keys? No. Jen, have you seen it? No, I haven't seen the keys. Somebody hasn't seen the keys. Okay. At that very moment, my phone rings. It buzzes in my pocket. I stick my hand in my pocket, and lo and behold, what's in there along with my phone? My keys. So what the gospel does is, this is as silly and as foolish as that sounds, we do the same thing every day when it comes to the gospel. We spend our lives slavishly looking for something we already possess, something that's already been given to us fully and finally by Jesus. Security, meaning, purpose, significance, direction, rescue, freedom, righteousness. We all look for all of those things every single day in 1,000 different ways. And so James comes in and says Jesus plus nothing equals everything. And everything minus Jesus equals nothing. Don't go out and buy a false version of what you already possess. Don't go out and buy a false version of freedom and rescue and righteousness and meaning and purpose, because you have all of those things fully and finally already in Christ. And the reason we do this, the reason that we have such a hard time believing in the rich provisional resources of the gospel is because, go back again, we looked at this last week too, go back again to the Garden of Eden. Let's look at the devil's strategy there. Okay, remember I said last week that the devil's strategy in your life and mine is to bring us down by building us up? Okay, well, if you look more closely at what was going on in the Garden of Eden and what was happening when the devil was tempting Adam and Eve, it was the devil that convinced us that God doesn't have our best interests at heart, and that we would actually do better if we look out for ourselves. See the connection between original sin and daily sins? Daily sins are simply a momentary expression of original sin. It's the same thing. The reason we take matters in our own hands the way James describes here is because we simply don't trust God to do it right. Well, where does that lack of trust come from? It comes from original sin. I mean, this idea that God doesn't have our best interests at heart, and so we have to look out for ourselves. We're afraid that God won't take care of us, and so we have to take care of ourselves. Remember God's instruction to the Israelites in the wilderness? He provided manna from heaven. The word manna literally means, what is it? There was no description. The Israelites had never seen food like this before. It wasn't bread, what was it? God provided for them food. He delivered food, physical nourishment to his people in the wilderness. And remember what he instructed them. He says, every morning I'm going to send you food from heaven. You need to go out and gather enough for that particular day, because I'll show up the next morning and give you enough food for that day. And then he said, if, however, you collect more, if you're gathering manna for the day to feed your family, and you say, you know what, I'm just not sure God's going to show up tomorrow morning, so just in case he sleeps in, I'm going to gather food for tomorrow too. I mean, we do this all the time. What did God say? He said, don't bother, because it'll spoil. If you gather food today for tomorrow, it won't even be edible. It'll be spoiled. So don't do it. And in doing so, he was training them to trust him every day, trusting that he would show up and provide everything they need. Well, ultimately, we see manna from heaven in the person of Christ. Christ comes to give his people what we need. He did that initially when he came the first time. He'll do that finally when he comes the second time. But in between the times, he distributes daily grace for the journey. Daily grace for every day. Jesus is our manna from heaven. He is the one who comes and serves us what we need on a daily basis. I mean, what did he say? He said, look at the lilies of the field. See how beautifully they are clothed? Now, if the Father is going to clothe lilies that way, don't you think he's going to take good care of you and give you everything you need? And so it really becomes a matter of trusting God where we can't trace him. That's the path of presumption. Quickly, the path of peace. He describes this in verse 14 and 15, interestingly enough. He says in verse 14, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. I mean, that's hard-hitting to our self-esteem culture. I'm not a mist, I'm a God. Okay, I'm not a mist, I'm the omnicompetent man. But interestingly, the pathway, listen carefully, the pathway of peace runs through verse 14. There is no peace apart from verse 14. The word mist is literally translated puff of smoke. Okay? And it has some connections with the vanity of vanities that is described in the book of Ecclesiastes. Look with me very quickly. Go back to Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. Most people attribute this to Solomon, the wisest, richest man in the world at that time, son of David, king in Jerusalem. He says in verse 9, chapter 2, "So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me." He accomplished more. He became rich and famous, and everybody knew who he was. "And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them." He could have whatever he wanted, in other words. He accomplished more in his life than 1,000 men. He embodied the American dream. Okay. "I kept my heart from no pleasure," specifically meaning there I could have any woman I wanted. Okay. Which is why he had combined, 1,000 wives and concubines. "I kept my heart from no pleasure, and my heart found pleasure in all my toil." In other words, I was satisfied with my work. "And this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered," verse 11, "all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it." Now he's an old man now, okay? He's reflecting on his life, all he accomplished, satisfaction of work, joy of pleasure, all of those things. And he's reflecting on it now, and behold, he says, "all was vanity, a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun." What he's saying there is when the American dream becomes your primary pursuit, and that's where you think you're going to find your meaning and your purpose and your security and your significance, you get to the end of your life and you're able to say, vanity of vanities, meaninglessness. I've been watching some biographies of John Wilkes Booth. There have been a lot of them on. There's a movie coming out about him, and so they've been on History Channel and Biography Channel. There have been a lot of biographies on John Wilkes Booth, and apparently when they finally caught up with him in that particular barn, John Wilkes Booth, as you know, shot Abraham Lincoln, and they finally tracked him down 18 days later, and he was in a barn, and they set the barn on fire because he wouldn't come out, and one of the cavalry shot through the barn, and it hit John Wilkes Booth in the neck, and it punctured his spine, and he became paralyzed. And so they went in and carried him out, and for 3 hours he sat on the front lawn of this barn, sort of coming in and out of consciousness. And they wanted him to be alive because they wanted him to go to trial. And the last words that came out of his mouth, he couldn't move his arms, he couldn't move his hands, okay, because he was paralyzed. And he asked to see his hands, okay? And so they lifted up his hands before his face. And the last word that came out of his mouth was worthless. And he died. Vanity of vanities. Life goes by fast. I mean, we are a mist, a puff of smoke, according to James. Now, why do I say the pathway of peace runs through verse 14? Because that sounds terribly, terribly depressing, doesn't it? I mean, a mist, a puff of smoke, that shouldn't liberate me. That makes me feel like a slave. It makes me feel like a nobody. Listen to me. The day you come to terms with your own expendability is the day you will be free. Because Jesus was strong for me, I'm free to be weak. Because Jesus was someone, I'm free to be no one. Only the gospel of Christ's finished work can enable you to revel and rejoice in your expendability, being able to say, it's not up to me anymore. And this world will go on just fine. You know, so much anxiety comes up in me when I think about, if something tragic happens to me, what will happen with my wife and my children? And I get anxious about that from time to time. Okay? And the gospel frees you. God says, I got it. Their well-being is ultimately not dependent on you anyway. So I got it. Okay? In fact, they'll just go on with life. You know, if you've experienced a death in your family, the pain is always there, but life goes on. Not everything's riding on you. And when you can grasp verse 14, you'll be free. When most of us stop long enough to consider what establishes our value, what really makes us who we are, many of us act as if the answer is our performance. In this book that I mentioned last week called Who Will Deliver Us? The Present Power of the Death of Christ, a great book, it's only about 85 pages. The writer says this: if I can do enough of the right things, I will have established my worth. Identity is the sum of my achievements. Hence, if I can satisfy the boss, meet the needs of my spouse and children, and still do justice to my inner aspirations, then I will have proven my worth. There are infinite ways to prove our worth along these lines. The basic equation is this: I am what I do. It is a religious position in life because it tries to answer in practical terms the question, who am I and what is my niche in the universe? On this reading, my niche is in proportion to my deeds. In Christian theology, such a position is called justification by works. It assumes that my worth is measured by my performance. Conversely, it conceals thinly a dark and ghastly fear. If I do not perform, I will be judged unworthy. To myself, I will cease to exist. That's the undergirding fear that many of us have. And this is where the gospel comes in. The gospel frees us from this obsessive pressure to perform, this enslaving demand to become, because the gospel liberatingly declares that in Christ we already are. While the world constantly tempts us to locate our identity in something or someone smaller than Jesus, the gospel liberates us by revealing that our true identity is locked in Christ. Our connection in and with Christ is the truest definition of who we are if we're Christians. So if you're a Christian, here's the good news. This is verse 14, mist-like good news. If you're a Christian, here's the good news. Who you really are, your truest identity, has nothing to do with you at all. How much you can accomplish, who you can become, your behavior, good or bad, your strengths, your weaknesses, your sordid past, your family background, your education, your looks. Who you really are has nothing to do with that at all. Your identity is firmly anchored in Christ's accomplishment, not yours. His strength, not yours. His performance, not yours. His ability, not yours. His control, not yours. His victory, not yours. That's who you are. Your identity is steadfastly established in His substitution, not your sin. How many Christian people live with a burden on their back like Christian from Pilgrim's Progress? Because they simply can't forgive themselves. They live with the overarching burden of guilt, believing that because of the huge mistake they made, the divorce that they had, the affair that they had, the abortion that they had, whatever, the huge mistake they had, they will down deep in their souls always know themselves to be that. And the gospel comes in and says, your identity is steadfastly established in His substitution, not your sin. It's finished. Done. Done. When you stand in the shadow of the cross, I love Pilgrim's Progress. When a Christian stands in the shadow of the cross, the burden rolls off his back down the hill into the empty tomb. It's done. My friend Justin said this yesterday. He said, the gospel doesn't just free you from what other people think about you, it frees you from what you think about yourself. Just a remarkable thing. Because down deep, we all know we're guilty. No matter what sort of front we put on, we all know we're guilty. We all know what we've done. We all know the secrets that we keep. There are secrets in your heart that nobody knows about except God. Things you've done. Deceptions that you have worked. Lust that you have nurtured. All of those things. God knows that. He knows it. Down deep, we know we're guilty. We know we're unrighteous. But the gospel doesn't just free you from what other people think about you. It frees you from what you think about yourself. You're free. So now you can spend your life giving up your place for others instead of guarding in your place from others, because your identity is in Christ, not your place. Now you can spend your life going to the back instead of getting to the front, because your identity is in Christ, not your position. Now you can spend your life giving, not taking, because your identity is in Christ, not your possessions. So Paul says in Colossians 2:12, we have been buried with Christ in baptism, in which we were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. You know what that means? It means that our old identity, the things that previously made us, have been put to death. And our new identity is in Christ. We've been raised with Christ to walk in newness of life, no longer needing to depend on the old things to make us who we are. All of this is our new identity, all because of Christ's finished work declared to us in the gospel. That's who we are. So we're free to be a mist. We're free to be a puff of smoke. In Christ, we have worth and purpose and security and significance that makes utterly laughable all the transient things of this world that we're so frequently tempted to identify ourselves by. So arrogance here reveals fear and leads to slavery. Humility reveals trust and leads to freedom. That's the equation. You know, he says here, just in conclusion, James says in verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. That's how you should live. Well, that comes from somewhere. Remember Jesus, Garden of Gethsemane, in Luke chapter 22, verses 39 to 42, he's praying to the Father with no support whatsoever from his disciples. He's praying to the Father the night before he's crucified, sweating profusely, what appeared to be drops of blood, and he's praying to the Father. He knows what he's about to face. It's not just the physical suffering he was going to endure, but he knew he was going to be absorbing the Father's wrath on behalf of sinners. And he's saying, oh, Father, if there's another way, let this cup pass from me. And how did he conclude his prayer? Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. It was the nevertheless of Christ's prayer that brought about cosmic redemption. It was the person of Jesus. It was Christ himself who was able to follow the pathway of peace, trusting his Father, absorbing the Father's wrath. He became a mist for you and for me, for sinners like us, so that we would one day become solid co-heirs with Christ. He accomplished this for us. And by his Spirit, he's accomplishing this in us. So which path are you following? Is it the pathway of presumption? Is it the pathway of peace? Have you assumed that the pathway of presumption is what promises freedom? When it actually leads to slavery, it's the pathway of peace. A pathway that has been paved by the blood of Christ. That alone can give us the freedom and the fullness that we long for.